Mademoiselle Boulanger was a luminous person. She would have been 138 today, but she's eternal in the hearts of those who were touched by her openness, expectation, attention, and very disciplined, enthused thrust to become the best of what you can become, to serve at your best what your calling determines that if your character pursues, you will serve at your best. It was always a question of humility, and a true one, while the open-ended awareness of the fact that you will study all your life didn't erase the desire to create something and to dare have it sourced in the essence of your being from your ancestors or from your culture or from the acquired situations where your personality, mind, and soul brought you to. In fact, I think she was a revealer of the true drive inside us. And while to many she could have appeared who didn't perhaps benefit from her positive outlook, by reputation from far away or even from the nearby surroundings of hers, appear like somebody severe, discouraging, and necessarily so selective through talent or a drive, whatever you want to call it. And then it would be just a sort of a fabric of egos through talents. Therefore, a certain level, and for sure that can be told for many places, elitism. But she was so committed to the service of her art, the craftsmanship of her art, as well as the art in the sense of the I would say, not only spiritual, but also soulful level of experience of what art form shapes in our subconscious and our conscious. The admiration that she had for the works of the art forms and of all art forms, as well as for the great composers and musicians whom she was student of, or friends with, or teachers of, that didn't scare the students who were presently seeking. And I saw so many around me from childhood to young man, as I was 10 years around her, that their seeking was really a spiritual seeking of their own self, and through her guidance. In that sense, really, a professor, a pedagogue is a guide who has a vision for you. And if it differs from the one you have for yourself, then there is a problem. If you are not sure because of all kinds of self-imposed censorships that you should pursue something for which you think you're not made for, or she would help you with her assistant, Mademoiselle Dieudonné, clear the horizon line of what you could be seeking, if you have the character, the endurance, and the commitment, despite all the odds, if you come from a wealthy family or not, if you come from famous parents, as she had students who were students of hers already who became famous, or if you came out of just yourself to her seeking for this guidance. And because the students in the 10 last years of her long life who were around me were so different in their individual path seeking, in their own seasons of life, and I have been a child, as I mentioned, when I was 7, and she was already in her early 80s. But by being there daily for my very demanding 3 or 4 lessons a week of 3 hours each, as well as for the group studio class on Wednesday afternoon devoted to analyzing, singing, or observing, or admiring, or trying to decipher some of the thought processes of the composer's analysis class of the great variety of repertoires from contemporary to early Renaissance, and not in chronological order. That was one of her mantras too. But the point is that even on Saturday mornings when we had, for the happy few, I don't know if it was happy, but it was few, who were challenged to follow her, or chosen as well, to study her keyboard harmony class. Skills on the keyboard that most harmonists, contrapuntists, conductors, composers do on the written document. Therefore, with a time of reflection, this was to be done on the spot, on the keyboard, transposing, reducing an orchestra score at first sight, of course, doing elaborate quality in the sense of voice leading quality, continual work through figured bass and such things, which required not only pianistic skills, though in certain extent they did, to a certain extent, but not really. It was more about her ideal for a musician to reach full musicianship status. Not amateur in everything, but awareness in depth of all the elements constitutive of the music making, from the hearing, which Mademoiselle Dieudonné taught us, to the discerning hearing, from the atonal and polyphonic dictations to the chordal discerning of dissonances with missing notes, or compare and contrast. In other words, to come with a perfect pitch, in which case was mine, but or not, at which level of hearing, the awareness of the hearing was taught by the two Mademoiselle Dieudonné and Boulanger to each of us, while individually Mademoiselle Boulanger in the one-to-one lessons would adapt to the individual personality, culture, language, artistic, but also familial inheritance, where you come from in terms of what the music in your country is, what the beliefs in your country is, what is your, how you face death, and how you face the meaning of beauty, and how you receive grace through art form, and how you struggle towards finding how you want to express yourself through the musical language. And these lessons were very revealing because, in part, in my case, it was very strict homework on harmony, contrapoint, and fugue, as well as analytical discovery of compositions of different styles where you learn the trade from observing how others developed their thoughts in music through the centuries. Of course, to have access to these, you have to read in the clefs, you have to know how to polyphonically follow voices or try to play them, and you write them down like a fugue of Bach every week from the Well-Temperate. And so you enter in a combination of, if you take the time to develop her skill teaching, which was my case since I was a child, open-ended, so to say, according to the opportunity which my parents offered me by bringing me to her and her choosing me, therefore bestowing on my shoulders that heavy burden of the expectation. But this is the same for the young people in their 20s or 30s or in their 18s of age who were around me, came mostly from the United States, but not only, but mostly, who were either students of hers at that point, of course, either because of her reputation and because of her reputation as somebody who will tell you the truth about yourself if you want to know it, and who already have a schooling, unlike what I had, which was just basic, very early childhood in my native Bulgaria, which was wonderful, but nevertheless, you cannot continue developing your musicianship only on ear-based drive. Would be good, but there is a glass ceiling you have to break. So the knowledge that you gather is there to be used as a tool towards finding your personal meaningful expression in your service of the muse, ultimately as a teacher or as a conductor or as a composer or as a performer or the combination of all, possibly as a musicologist, a scholar, or also not unrelated to a performer. In other words, she was not putting walls between the ways that you grow in music. And of course, that didn't mean that she was accepting of near expectations. It had to be serving at your best what you were doing. Would it be a transposing accompaniment of an art song? Or it has to be therefore learned with the clefs and deal with the occidentals and be able to do that without hesitation. So you develop a technique, a skill. Naturally, in hindsight today, over 40 years after her passing, I realize, as I was taught then about some of these skills, that today they're less important because scores are published in every key, so you don't have to transpose it if you accompany. You don't always have to read in the clefs to learn the transposing instruments in the orchestral score reading, but then sometimes it helps, and if it comes of use. So perhaps some of the skills which she was, of course, taught to learn when she was growing up in the late 19th century around Gabrielle Fauré, who was her teacher, when I arrived in her late life, in her 80s, 60 years after her young sister, first student of hers really, Lily, who was a genius composer who died at 24. Therefore, I was inheriting her expectation of what was expected of her, as well as what was expected of her young sister. Then again, this was in another time period where already, without the technology of today, because in those days of the 70s, early 70s, there were no software for composition, there were no software for notation, there were no intelligence, artificial or assisted or whatever you want. Of course, there are no these tools which can bypass certain necessities to learn the grammar from the ground up of your musical I would say, mother tongue, that is your language to express yourself. And then if you don't go through grammar and syntax and reading skills and using the meaning of the words to understand the meaning of the world is understood by the people who understood it before you, then you cannot read. Therefore, you only repeat as a child does at the early development before school starts for these skills. The onomatopoeias that become sounds, which become words, which has a direct meaning, but not necessarily the functions of elaborating thoughts. And this is exactly what I think is important, because she didn't differentiate the fact that you would destine yourself to be a performer or a conductor, a theorist, or a teacher. Necessarily, you had to have this baggage of know-how and knowledge. And for those who spend only few of their, let's say, 1 or 2 years between under and grad in the States, and that was a financial expense to come to Paris. So it was for my parents. So I know that all this is time and money. And when I was a child, because of that open-ended early childhood arrival at somebody who is at the postscriptum of her life, I mean, obviously any day was possibly the last for her. And I was aware of that through my parents' pressure on me. But this parenthesis put aside, even if I was older, already formatted to a certain extent by schooling musician with a skill or not, I would still have to rediscover the meaning of the harmonic progressions of the circle of fifths, how they give birth by jumping over one to the step motion, which then gives the birth to the scale with the tetrachords, and therefore organizing chordal progressions with chords on each of the degrees of the scale, and then organizing chords in societies despite their individuality, how you work on them with their inversions in canonic ways, so you understand that in fact it is a pattern of layered elements. And all this of course, takes time to study, to relearn. If you learned to re-understand or filling the gaps of what perhaps was bypassed when you started early a skill, because that's often what happens when people start an instrument. And then perhaps later you evolve to become a singer, which you don't start as a child, or you abandon music as a profession or a pursuit. And then you keep it only as an inner garden, as an inner poetry, as a reflective life, becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or a thinker, or anything or nothing. But in other words, he wasn't there to study with her to become this or to be better than the other at that. It was to become the best of who you could become. And since that is by itself an open-ended situation, she would not haste the answers by giving them pre-cooked and hoping that you can this way jump to the next stage faster. There was no compromise with musicianship in her way of teaching. In that sense, she was a luminous person, because while she was highly expecting of you, she was also highly, when believing in you, demanding of you by giving you the thrust to hint to you that you're worth something. Even if you are humble to the point to which you think you're worth quasi-nothing. And that is not so contradictory than that, because I think that she never stifled the creativity in order to fill it in with theory, knowledge, and skill. I think the intuition, the drive, the musical gift, if that is the word that sort of replaces all others, is there to be blossomed through work with a short, mid, and long-term goal. It then depended of the character, it depended of the means, it depended of the capacity to sustain the very harsh realities of the technique, to write, to hear, to notate, to play, to understand, to sight read, to transpose, to basically converse with the musical language, which is hinted in the thoughts of the composer, notated and then published, and which reach you centuries later, and you have to make sense of it besides only what others have wrote, recorded, or perorated about, which is great because you need to be aware of what your predecessors have done with this field. But you have to explore it yourself. So she would give you the tools to explore it yourself. In that sense, she was luminous. She was not just a defeatist or somebody who will be discouraging for the purpose of discouraging, because sometimes, unfortunately, competitivity develops a sense of an industry that is based on eliminating either the weakest, either the ones who are not competitive enough. And that could be through performance competitions or through compositions, through expectations of stylistic or musical language worlds to explore or to identify or to develop or to imagine. So when I give all these concepts here in memory of Mademoiselle's approach, is because I know that with time and with distance and with the death of most of the people who have studied with her and who didn't all have individually a comparable experience with her as I did, and I didn't have theirs either. So I'm very humble and altruistic in my respect of the differences of what each of us around her were seeking when I was there, let less all the generations who were seeking this with her before my own parents were born. I mean, that was such century-long tradition, almost as if she was, not that she was intellectually stuck in the 19th century, because she wasn't. Perhaps for educative purposes of some of the grammar ways, yes. But she was always open for the musical language of her creative students, and they went through their own searches about post-tonal or still tonal or serial or whichever aesthetics which some gurus in classical music in the 20th century were imposing as the avant-garde, which by essence is always passed by the next, and those who were thinking of keeping in their expression elements, if not structures, of the past expressions that shaped the musical languages of so many different styles for centuries before ours. And so between those who had to say something in music, no matter how, and those who were eager to find a way to say it other than the way it was already said, she would be there amazingly advising and incredibly defining. And I think ultimately the answer to each of the quests, from an exercise to who you become, were yours. But next to her, you obtained the right way to shape the question about it. And in that sense, she was a thought provoker. She was inevitably a remover of status quo. And also the fact that she, at the point where I met her in her long life, she had already been the closest musical friend and advisor of Stravinsky, which is not a little thing to say when you know his character was. And by admiration for her musicianship and knowledge and know-how and an enthused drive to help and him to obtain commissions and perform them, even conduct them for him, as she did for her students, Copland and so many. In her early years, she sort of in fact, she was so many different people to so many different students, and she adapted to them for them. And then in the general aspect of her demeanor, her language, her vocabulary, her expectation, her own choices of life and aesthetic choices too. She never mixed her memories of the personal encounters with Fauré, Ravel, Debussy, Poulenc, and so many more, with their music when she was teaching it to us, to me. It was their work is separate from who they were, and there was no desire or need to bridge the two through the rare, obviously, opportunity to have been there, knowing them personally. Who wouldn't dream to have known Mozart or Beethoven when we play them? As if that is the key to the answer to how we would understand what they notated. But in fact, the analytical approach of hers was more about their thought process and how we perceive it, and how we need to go ahead and understand the Bach cantata and the gesture of an interval and the meaning of a usage of a repeated note or an accompaniment pattern and the quality of the secondary voices and the meaning of the interaction of the layered voices and pulses, and not always be framed by what we see on the score by the bar lines, but to see the phrases that overlap. To see not only, but to conceptualize, to render through that inner hearing of what we obtained from having understood the score. Of course, most of the composers of the past were performers, and therefore a lot of that was embedded in their notation or hinted, or not necessarily fully determined, especially in the fact that they had to write so much in so little time. And in fact, today we can have more time to learn and study what and how they meant it. But we are away from their time, and so we keep the essence of the actuality of their creativity beyond and outside only of their context in time and history and instruments and acoustics and way of perceiving music and the purpose of a musician in society then and all that. The oeuvre remains, just like she was separating it, as I tried to explain this, from having known them. So no anecdotic connections were told to make us feel more close to the composition of these composers. She treated them with the same reverence and seriousness and admiration and distance as she did Schütz or Buxtehude or the music of Monteverdi or the closer to us composers in time. And because I mentioned earlier her mantra was no chronology, it wasn't that she mixed the styles because she ignored them. It was because she really had a special conviction that through the evolution of their musical languages and the purpose of a dissonance for a consonance and the tension and the release and the connection to the lyrics and the symbolic gestures of the intervals, the harmonic coating, or the evolution of the expression from formatted to breaking the form to express itself freely, or then without restatements in order to be only down to the essence. In fact, it was very striking to see that she didn't try to make us believe that Monteverdi and Poulenc were similar, because they aren't. But there are similitudes in the approach of the musical expression of the spiritual uplifting that their music brings to us, either heard, either read. That's not the same, because when you read it, you start understanding things that you couldn't guess when you hear it. Where is an upbeat, where is a downbeat, how he structures the phrase, and how we could do it if we played, and perhaps why does the notation not always correspond to the intent that you perceived in the hearing that the composer chose to do, from the meter or change of meter to the structure of the tempo marking, and even the instrument on which you played, and what was the drive besides the phrasing, direction, organization, or fragmentation. As I say, I'm throwing here a lot of concepts which come out to be obvious when you dig into the musical language of composers, because you love them, or you're curious, or because you're taught, or because you're told, and you end up by developing a certain awareness of what makes their specificity, their differences, but as well, therefore, also what is in common. And it is true that this communality was not just an aha moment, but it was more about a general, humble structure of awareness that things don't just appear on their own, but they carry through something that they received and which they adapted to what they had to express in their own creativity without rejecting it all. Some are in part, and some less than others, as she used to say about Schubert, that he didn't have to reject what he received to express himself. And other composers have to rethink the paradigm, they have to rethink the tonality, they have to rethink the pulse meter structure, either or from other origins, extra-European or wherever traditions, or just an intellectual construction of the musical expression that leads art forms to develop different ways to express themselves. All these things were fascinating to me around her when she was not only the teacher of me, but the teacher of all my colleagues around me who were passing by and leaving. And in those days of the past, in the 70s, of no internet, the keeping in touch was less obvious, besides the fact that people developed the lanes of their own lives, which drove them far away from that temporary communal nest that was Mademoiselle's apartment, Rue Balue in Paris, where we gathered together on Wednesdays, and for the few of us on Saturdays, and for the lucky of us had lessons during the week. And I stayed there for almost 10 years. And what did I learn from this repetitivity? Inevitably so, when teachers teach about their beliefs, which are usually repeated, not only for the purpose of it, but because it's also a restatement of their opinion and their ideology. And stylistically, she didn't oblige her students to write like Fauré or Stravinsky because he was her teacher and her closest admired colleague. And she would encourage them to write atonal and post-dodecaphonic, whatever, all these different languages were very important to her, and she wasn't swaying them or us, them being one of them, me, but was always getting back to the essence of who you are and what you're doing with your life in service of the muse. You have to put sincerity and meaning in your cerebral elaboration of the musical element, as well as keeping the drive of your emotional, intuitive, inherited, soulful background. And she was very interested in combining both and not erasing the one to feeling by the other. In other words, you didn't go there to become savant if you were just driven by your intuition, because it wasn't either or, it was both. But of course, that is the key to all, is that individually you make that mix. And that mix takes years and perhaps never reaches. Perhaps people abandon it because it's too much of a great endeavor to undertake and prefer to already explore in fullness or as possibly fully one individual skill of them all, which would be a performance, for instance. It's easy to say for a student, I'm not good at this, I'm better at that. I'll jump from this to that because I think I have an opportunity to see a long-term future for myself in this field, or then I'm discouraged. I don't see any point. Everything was written before me. What's the point of me adding to it creatively? But then I could teach it how to be performed with that conviction that I have received from my teacher to develop my own, therefore transmit it as a hyphen to the next generation. And in that sense, I think it was very important to combine humility with drive and awareness and knowledge, and not replace them. And some people had more difficulty finding the right balance between these demanding things of yourself, because too much humility would stifle creativity, and too much awareness that anything I do is essentially unique because I'm unique leads to lost in the space of the fact that you have to structure your thoughts. You have to structure even your novelty thought. And therefore, afterwards, take out the structure and just keep the thought and then insert it into the musical language. In other words, you use the tools that by themselves aren't the end. The technique is not the pianism, but without technique, there is no artistic pianism. And same thing with creativity for composing, writing, improvising, transposing, imagining, organizing, or restructuring an existing work in a different format or shape, with a respect for the text without being arrogant with it, while you feel in a given acquaintance with the musical language of a given composer's world that you took time to immerse yourself in. And then as a performer or a composer or a musicologist, you become not a scholar of it per se, but you could. You become enough aware of it that you develop a path within this language, which could lead through a door on the side to another universe that you will explore. Of course, all these things are beautifully said or easily said or just thrown like that, these concepts, because I have lived so many lives since I was a child, between her death when I was 17 and a half, and today with my own students, generations already. And I can see how much all this plays in my understanding of who she was to us or to me, and who I hope to always be more meaningful to my own students in their own path and searching of themselves through skill in the case of piano playing, but also that englobes the opening of the horizons, exponential understanding of what it means to serve the muse in order to either serve it as a performer or as a teacher or as a composer, or perhaps as just a curious mind who has an attraction for an aspect of an art form that makes you travel in an escapism that reaches levels that cannot be described in words per se, because that's the spiritual uplifting. And so I find that this aspect should be always kept together, as Mademoiselle always did, by example and by teaching, with the pedestrian work on the essential skills that you had to acquire in order to soar in the sky in your daydreams, music making. Yeah. My analogies are not very philosophical, but they come out very intuitively, because I find that between the strict discipline which ties the hands of the creativity and then the unleashing from these rules, understood for which purpose they were defining you to search beyond the easy solution of a certain lazy option. But then poetically, it can be a beautiful one as well. It's not to be rejected. In other words, complexity is not better than simplicity in poetry. A fugue is not more beautiful or meaningful than an art song by Schubert, because they're the two different expressions of the meaning of the musical drive that they had to express, either through a text, either through pure music, as we call it, for the voices by themselves, or the voice leading rather. The societal organization of the parts and the voices in a quartet, in a piano sonata with many voices, or accompaniment, or chamber musicianship, collaborating with others to construct a piece which has therefore several lanes which combine with the melodic, the harmonic, the contrapuntal, and the pulse and the rhythmic, and how you bring it alive from the dead page through what drives you in it, what appeals you in it and into it. And I find that she was very helpful to that enticement, while respectively keeping us from, she would say to me, especially since I was so driven to create, she would say, if you don't understand or like the way some things are written by great composers whom you play, then write your own piece. But when you play them as what they meant, or you think they did in how they developed their thoughts. And so that's why when I teach, I often give alternatives of how this section could have gone into this if the composer had chosen another way to develop the thought, or to travel through the thought, or not develop the thought, just motivically restate it, whatever. Debussy doesn't do the development of a thought of a Beethoven, obviously, and that is clear to all of us when we're in music. But then the atmospheric combined with the organized, the driven combined with the daydreamed, and the idea that music is not only a background, but it's also a creator of, is a language, universal more or less. Of course, you have to be able to read and speak it. But even by hearing it only, it's a vehicle for reflection for all of us, philosophically speaking. So that's why when we're gathered to hear music, for whichever purpose we got there, either because we know the performer, or because we want to please somebody who we are with, or we want to enjoy hearing how some other famous or young artist or new artist is restating the narrative of this piece that we already like by such another, or by our own reading, if we can or could. But then we perceive in the same space, in real time, at different levels, what we receive. Not only the wrong notes, if they are, not only the thought process of the composer, if we can detect them in real time, as if we have access to a GPS of the thought process of the composer in real time when we discover a piece. Just let ourselves be just marveled by the storytelling by itself. And even if puzzled by aspects of it, or not understanding the lengths of it, or the brevity of it, or whatever oddity of it that we might reject by saying, oh, it's too dissonant, or it's not enough this, or it's too long for this. Well, it's for us, but we don't have to, and we shouldn't belittle it according to our perception. We have to go to the piece rather than the piece only coming to us in the first place. And then how do we do that? If we cannot read it, then we have to hear it by others and start developing our own tastes about it. And tastes evolve, and styles of interpretation evolve, and people have to agree to disagree. But that is the richness of the texture. I think that is the wonder that makes that the same piece means so many different things to so many people. And not only intuitively, but also. I don't want to reject the intuition because my teacher was insisting on teaching the know-how. In other words, I'm very grateful to have been privileged through the sacrifice of their own professional and personal life of my parents to bring me towards her when I was born in Sofia and she was in Paris, and I was 7 and she was 83. And the trip was one way in geographic and life path way. Pressure, expectation, disappointment, struggle, failed expectation, intuition that doesn't drive you the way that was driving earlier students of hers that were so successful to her, and so she would put me in comparison with them. And so, yes, she was a luminous person, as I wanted to mention in this celebration of her what would have been 138th birthday. That's an anecdotic number, but fact. Because in the end of it, if I can bring something of the essence of hers for my students, which I strive to do, I would be very grateful to have been able to be a hyphen through her to them, as she was from Forêt and so on. And once we are aware of this, it doesn't mean that we stick ourselves in that tradition. It means that it allows us to rethink the things. How to redefine the harmonic progression, how to redefine the voice leading, how to redefine the learning of a fugue and following the parts. In other words, it's for each student's seeking, finding a respectful, demanding, but also enthusing map to go through, if they have the courage and the character to go through. Because if not, we remain on the surface of things, imitating this, imitating that. We need to imitate to learn, and then we have to find what makes our... In fact, we don't search for it. It appears by itself. It's something that you defy any explanation. And when you compare an early Beethoven sonata from a Haydn one, or a late Mozart section from an early Beethoven piece, and you find these beyond similarities, communalities, I find this humbling. And at the same time, it shows that we are part of a long lineage. To reject or to accept, but at the same time that brings us to be grateful. And I am so much to her that I wanted to make sure that in case some people vehicle opinions and ideologies through her, not having known her, that correspond to theirs, and using her persona or historic persona and her pedagogical approach to promote our compositions, their own agenda through her, is not fair. It should be only who she was. And I am humbly the witness who can say that. Not that I have the pretension to understand the whole universe that she represented, because of course she lived so much longer than I was around her. But since her passing, I spent so much time while working on developing what I was doing in music, and for the students and for the concerts and for the performances and the compositions. The awareness of Raoul Pugnot for her life, in her life, and the awareness of the Paul Vidal and the musicians and the writers, Paul Valéry and others who were meaningful in her inner world and her own development as a independent woman in music in times where there was no independent woman in anything in Western Europe. And she was doing it in serving the music without to serve herself in any political aspect of the things, in terms of feminism, for instance, or other revendication. And I find that to be honoring her is to state who she was by the incredible charisma which her way of being in music inspired us and me, while keeping in mind the understanding of who she was herself, from where she came, and how she became to be the teacher who she became, by the musician who she was, and the composer who she interrupted but was, and the conductor and the performer and the conference music teacher of rediscoverer of old musical languages of before and the Renaissance itself, as well as encouraging contemporary music of her own students through the 20th century, while advising friends like Ravel, who were both in Forest's class. So, these things are difficult to define at which level people have their own ego and their own fulfillment when they are called Ravel or Milhaud or Stravinsky or whoever they were, De Falla and others, and then how they interacted and what they received from each other or rejected from each other. In her case, because of her teaching that became her calling for personal reasons in her long life, I find that to be a very altruistic and humble approach. So I admire her very much for her courage in her own life, as well as I am grateful for what she gave me, as she did to the students around me during the 10 years of her last decade. And even if time passes since, and most of us disappear or will disappear who were witnesses at our own level, I want to make sure that for those who would watch this, if they do, in times ahead, I have mentioned how meaningful she was to each of us, how uneasy it was for us to accept her guiding criticism, how trustworthy we were in what she expected of us for ourselves, and how grateful we are. Oh, I am, for sure, forever, for having been exposed at such an early age to somebody who was a universe by herself, and how much I miss her since, and how much I fulfill a lot of her beliefs in what I teach with my students. It's not textual, it's not the same, it cannot be the same because it's them and I'm not her. And it was me and I wasn't another student, and it was her who was different with each of us. But the service to the muse and to have done the best of you could all the time was such a beautiful philosophy of life to learn from her by her example. Thank you. Thank you, Mademoiselle.